What is forced labor? When it comes to this, most people first think of the Atlantic slave trade that supplied people from the African continent as cheap labor to the colonial heirs of the American continent in the Atlantic Rim between the 16th and 19th centuries. The Atlantic slave trade was not the only African slave trade, but it was certainly the largest and most brutal in history. After the discovery of the New World, the desire of European colonists to exploit the land and resources of the New World for the benefit of their assets led to a shortage of labor, which became one of the causes of the Atlantic slave trade. Native Americans were first enslaved by Europeans, but due to hard labor and Old World diseases most of them died. Then the colonists tried to enslave the Native American Indians, but they did not get any obvious gains, until they discovered that the power of blacks was much greater than that of Indians, and that blacks were very immune to tropical diseases. It was cheaper to use black slave labor to share the cost, and it was easier to manage. Therefore, in the process of long-term trafficking in blacks, the colonists gradually formed a set of profitab, the slave trade system. In the ports of West Africa, the colonists used wooden yokes and chains to lock the stripped slaves for the slave traders to choose like livestock. The selected slaves were then branded with a red soldering iron to indicate their affiliation, and then mounted on a slave ship. After that, black slaves planted tobacco and cotton in North American plantations, planted sugarcane in the West Indies, developed gold and silver deposits in Central and South America, and planted tea trees in India. Just like the movie 12 Years a Slave. 12 Years a Slave is a 2013 biographical period drama film, and an adaptation of the 1853 slave memoir 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, a New York State-born free African-American man who was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. by Tacoma, and in 1841 sold into slavery. Northup was put to work on plantations in the state of Louisiana for 12 years before being released. The first scholarly edition of Northup's memoir, co-edited in 1968 by Sue Eakin and Joseph Logsdon, carefully retraced and validated the account of N.D. concluded it to be accurate. Other characters in the film were also real people, including Edwin and Mary and Patsy. Solomon Northup was sold to Edwin, a middle-aged slave owner nicknamed the Black Killer, and picked cotton from his manor. Here Northup witnessed the tragedies of many black slaves. Due to the demanding requirements of the slave owners, many black slaves were flogged because of the daily cotton harvest not meeting the requirements. Among them, the fate of a young black slave Percy was the most profound because Percy was coveted by Edwin. She was discriminated against and abused by Mary, Edwin's wife. Although she harvested the most cotton every day, she had been living a miserable life. Although at the end of the film, Northup finally returned to his hometown and reunited with his family with the help of kind people. This film is the epitome of slavery plantations in the New World, and the tip of the iceberg in the history of the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade resulted in a large number of casualties of African slaves, and the number is still unknown.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. In other words, it grants freedom to all Americans. There are exceptions, including criminals.
There's a clause, a loophole.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that.
A little country with 5% of the world's population having 25% of the world's prisoners? One out of four human beings with their hands on bars, shackled, in the world are locked up here in the land of the free.
There are far fewer whites in prisons than blacks. Just like in the documentary Angola, you can see the former slave plantations turned into prisons, and prisoners in prisons work for a better life. So, what is forced labor?